From hardtack to acorns, unconventional Civil War foods that tell history. When you picture the American Civil War, images of epic battles and famous generals probably come to mind. But what about what they ate, with supply lines cut, blockades in place, and farmers abandoning their fields to join the fight? Food shortages were a constant struggle. Soldiers and civilians on both sides had to get creative to fill their stomachs, making do with whatever was on hand. In today's episode of Weird History from the World, we're diving into the strange and surprising foods people ate during the Civil War. But before we get started, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which other historical menus you'd like us to uncover next. Time to dig in, Civilicious. Everybody loves their coffee, and so did Civil War soldiers. In fact, one historian discovered that the word coffee appeared more frequently in letters from the era than war, slavery, or even Lincoln. Union soldiers often wrote about how they brewed it, while Confederate soldiers complained about not having any. Before the war, coffee was a staple in American households. But during the conflict, it turned into a rare luxury. Both Union and Confederate troops drank as much coffee as they could get their hands on, but when real coffee wasn't available, they improvised. Soldiers brewed makeshift coffee from anything they could roast and grind: peanuts, chicory, grains, apples, and sometimes even acorns or sweet potatoes. According to Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart, making sweet potato coffee was simple. Peel and chop sweet potatoes into pieces about the size of coffee beans, dry them in the sun, toast them until browned, and grind them into a powder. Mixed with hot water, it produced a thick, bitter drink that was at least warm and somewhat comforting. The South sometimes mockingly nicknamed their improvised brews Lincoln coffee due to the bizarre ingredients forced on them by the Union blockade. Soldiers were so obsessed with coffee that families back home sent recipes and homemade blends to the front lines. One famous moment saw General George Pickett bragging about a sweet potato blend his wife sent him, claiming it was better than the finest mocha or Java. Sure, George, whatever helps you get through the war. When it came to meat, the Army intended fresh rations to last just 3 days. The problem? Without refrigeration, fresh cuts quickly spoiled or were swarmed by flies, so both armies heavily relied on preserved meat, namely salt beef and salt pork. These pickled proteins could last longer but weren't exactly gourmet. Salt beef, also known as salt horse, was so heavily salted and treated with saltpeter that it turned a sickly yellow-green. Civil War veteran John D. Billings described it as a foul-smelling horror that almost nobody could stomach. Salt pork, nicknamed salt belly, wasn't much better, usually blackened, tough, and universally hated. Soldiers had to soak these meats in water to leach out enough salt to make them edible. After that, they could be boiled, stewed with beans, or sometimes eaten raw between slabs of rock-hard hardtack. Billings claimed salt pork was at least better than salt horse, but still practically indigestible. According to the revised U.S. Army regulations of 1861, Union soldiers received 12 ounces of pork or bacon and just over a pound of beef per ration. They also got flour, cornmeal, and a pound of hardtack, those notorious tooth-cracking biscuits, with the occasional bonus of coffee, sugar, dried fruit, or vinegar when available. Confederate rations were even worse. Blockades made it difficult to get meat into the South, so soldiers had to get creative. Sometimes they replaced meat entirely with a mixture of rice and molasses. Cooks would add cornmeal to stretch the meal further. Molasses was sticky, strong-flavored, and an acquired taste, but it worked as a makeshift sweetener when sugar supplies ran dry and was mixed into a variety of desperate recipes on the Confederate side. And you thought your lunch was bad. In an era where we can get gourmet meals delivered in under 30 minutes, the food situation during the American Civil War was a whole different story. With supply shortages everywhere, especially in the South, soldiers got resourceful. Take slosh, for example. It was essentially a heavy, greasy stew made from bacon drippings, flour, and water. A Southern soldier's dream if you loved bacon, and if you didn't mind a little heartburn. It was quick, cheap, and easy to make. Just fry up some bacon, toss in watered-down flour, and cook it down until it thickened into a pasty meal. Variations like Confederate Kush added beef or crumbled cornbread for extra flavor. There was even a pancake-style version called slapjack, where a flour paste was browned on both sides. Not exactly IHOP, but it would have paired nicely with a drizzle of syrup if they had any. While the North generally had better access to food, certain luxuries like chocolate were impossible to find in the South. But cravings don't just go away during wartime, so people got inventive. Enter peanut chocolate. In the absence of cocoa, Southerners roasted peanuts, or pinders as they called them. removed the skins, crushed them into a paste, and mixed them with hot milk and a little sugar. According to an 1850s memoir, it made a surprisingly decent hot drink. Was it Swiss Miss? Absolutely not, but it warmed you up, and in those days that was enough. Not to be outdone, tea drinkers had to improvise too. Actual tea leaves were scarce on both sides, so soldiers brewed tea from just about anything growing nearby: sassafras bark, huckleberry branches, dried currant leaves, and even corn husks or bran. And for those seeking a little extra protein with their drink, there was beef tea. Literally boiling chopped beef in water to create a meaty broth, it was often served in military hospitals as a kind of medicine. Spoiler: most patients weren't fans. When sugar supplies ran dry, people turned to natural substitutes. Molasses was a go-to sweetener, but when even that was scarce, soldiers made watermelon syrup. Yep, puree seedless watermelon. Simmer it down with sugar until it thickens into syrup, then store it for desserts or to sweeten bitter coffee. Watermelon rind didn't go to waste either. Cooks would soak it in salt water and alum, then preserve it for future use, a recipe dating back to at least the 1850s. But the most infamous food of the Civil War, that would be hardtack. A tough dry cracker made from flour, salt, and water, it was basically a square brick of misery. Soldiers often dipped it in coffee or tea to soften it, and sometimes to float out the worms that infested the biscuits. Yep, they called them worm castles. Army veteran John D. Billings once joked that eating in the dark was the only way you wouldn't know if your hardtack was crawling with bugs. And if that wasn't bad enough, it also tended to mold or go rock hard in storage, requiring soldiers to smash it with their rifle butts just to eat. To make hardtack more edible, soldiers came up with makeshift recipes like milk toast, soaking hardtack in condensed milk for a richer flavor. Problem was, condensed milk was pricey at 75 cents a can, so only soldiers with deep pockets could afford it. Others got creative with hardtack pudding, crushing the crackers, mixing them with flour and water, and baking them into a crust with whatever bits of fruit they could find. Fresh produce was a rarity, so soldiers made do with desiccated vegetables. Essentially dehydrated veggie cubes of carrots, onions, celery, and greens. Designed to add a little nutrition to soups and stews, these cubes were universally hated and quickly nicknamed desecrated vegetables. Gross as they were, they helped prevent scurvy and vitamin deficiencies, especially when beans, rice, or potatoes weren't available. The poor quality of camp cooking was such a disaster that the U.S. Sanitary Commission stepped in. James M. Sanderson, an officer with the commission, was horrified by what he called the unwholesome cooking practices of volunteer regiments. He experimented with better campfire techniques and cooking methods, urging cooks to cut back on excess fat, salt, and sugar. Sanderson left behind dozens of recipes, including a stew known as commissary Brazilian stew, made by simmering vinegar-marinated beef with onions, sometimes potatoes, and slowly cooking it for hours over an open flame. Necessity bred culinary invention in Civil War camps. Soldiers and civilians came up with recipes like water cakes, where eggs were beaten with cold water, lightly salted, and baked, or ash cakes made from cornmeal and water wrapped in corn husks and cooked under hot ashes. If cooked in a pan, it was called a hoe cake, and in an oven it became corn pone. One Southern classic was hog and hominy, a simple but beloved dish of pork cooked with boiled corn, often served with greens or potatoes. It was so closely tied to the Southern way of life that Abraham Lincoln once mentioned it during a war strategy meeting, warning that failing to take Vicksburg would mean endless supplies of hog and hominy for Confederate troops. And for the lucky few, there were rissoles. Essentially Civil War-era meat fritters. These were minced meat, seafood, or even oysters mixed with egg, breadcrumbs, and spices, then fried in hot fat. Served on holidays or special occasions, they were a rare treat in an otherwise bleak culinary landscape. So now the question is, which of these Civil War dishes would you actually try? Would you go for Confederate slosh, peanut chocolate, or maybe some beef tea? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're here, check out our other Weird History from the World videos for more bizarre, fascinating, and sometimes horrifying historical menus.